So how is the history of Juneteenth in Tulsa impacting present-day Americans? Well, let's bring in Tuskegee University Assistant Professor of History, Sheena Harris. Welcome to the show.
Welcome. Thank you for having me here today.
And I want to start first with the local reaction to President Trump's plans for his rally in Tulsa.
In terms of the local reaction, there were a number of highbrows that saw President Trump's selection of June 19th and Tulsa, Oklahoma, as in many ways a slap in the face. One, because June 19th is the celebration of emancipation for African Americans, but also just the history within Tulsa, Oklahoma, as it being the home of one of the largest domestic acts of terrorism that we've seen outside of 9/11.
And we certainly saw he was criticized for being tone deaf about that and did eventually turn into the pressure. But I do want to talk about Tulsa's Greenwood community, known as Black Wall Street, which flourished as a self-contained hub in the early 1900s before white mobs destroyed it. What were the characteristics of the place and the people that made that area so successful?
There are so many unique characteristics in terms of Greenwood. Some of the more alarming ones, or the more visible ones, is that Greenwood had a very large or high population of Black businesses. And so we all know the history of America, where segregation and Jim Crow laws ran rampant. And however, within Greenwood, you see a large number of Black businesses that are not only opening up businesses within Greenwood, but they're also offering loans to Blacks that live in Greenwood where they would not be able to have those loans as well. Another really interesting characteristic in terms of Greenwood is the very high number of Blacks who actually own their homes and that are owning their businesses as well. And so these characteristics, amongst a plethora of others, are really setting Greenwood aside, are setting it apart from other communities. And then lastly, the thing that I would say is that in Greenwood, you have a very large percentage of the Blacks who are living there who are also investing their money back into that community. And so that's also helping to fuel or to stimulate that particular economy as well.
And we did see a particularly large number of Black townships after the Civil War were located in Oklahoma. So talk a bit about Black Wall Street's influence on other communities built by and for Black people.
And so, as a point that I mentioned a little bit earlier, is that you also have, because you have this segregation and because you have Jim Crow laws and Plessy versus Ferguson, that is really, really strategically separating Blacks from whites, you have a very high percentage of Blacks that are going into business for themselves. And so one of the things are the unique characteristics that you see that I mentioned earlier in Greenwood is that you have Black businesses that are now also giving loans to other Black businesses, or that are giving loans to other Blacks. And so you have this model that is going to be replicated throughout Oklahoma, but also this model that's going to be replicated throughout other Black communities as well. That's promoting buying Black, investing in Black businesses, but also home ownership as well.
And so from the 1900s now to 2020, we still see systemic racism throughout the country's fabric, both hidden and overtly. So what does that actually mean then for the economic reality for Black Americans today?
There's so many things. And one of the things that I would say is that since this period of emancipation, you have a very, very high percentage of Black Americans, millions who are moving into the middle class, who are receiving advanced degrees and moving into these professional entities. We just had our first Black president, but I think one of the things in terms of systematic racism that should not be lost in some of these gains is that a majority of Black Americans are still being disproportionately impacted by systematic racism. And this disproportion is hitting numbers that are alarming. There was a study that was recently done on median household incomes. And one of it was that the median household income for African Americans in the United States was $17,000, and that was parred against a white median income of $170,000. And so even if we look at these numbers, we see that they are grossly disproportionate. And so while we still see some advancements, I think one of the larger lessons that we see is that systematic and that the dismantling of systematic racism has to be done, and it has to be done economically as well.
So then what are Black communities today doing differently or the same, or what should they be doing to really try and close that gap, to try and gain back some of that economic prosperity?
Well, some of it is this notion of bringing attention to the fact that it actually exists in a or with a form of systematic racism and systematic these systems within our society that are really not allowing for these opportunities. It's only so much that the community who is oppressed can do. However, in the midst of that, you still see a number of Black communities that are investing Black, and that is something that you see historically throughout American society. You have Black folks who are also putting their money into Black banks, who are owning more land, who are educating themselves and others on economic success, and who are pushing for reparations as well. And so you see some of the strategies that have been age old, but I think you see some of the new ones in terms of just this rise of investing Black in doing things in terms of education that we haven't seen before.